Hi, this is Heather again with Nonviolence in a Violent World, K2Z. Now, this one, it's impossible to do this topic complete justice, but we are going to look at questions that are usually unquestioned. And I'm hoping that by the end of this video, you will feel really uncomfortable with the idea of nonviolence and also uncomfortable with how violent our state is. So we're going to start with that. And most of you should have been through the white supremacy culture patterns video or workshop. And I just want to bring up a few patterns that I think are very relevant to the discussion on nonviolence. One is the pattern on either or, the binary. The idea that things are one or the other, that there's no nuance, no complexity, that things are very simplistic. And so throughout this, you should see that it's very tricky to say nonviolent, violent. Another one is the pattern of there being only one right way to do things. So the idea that there's a particular tactic that everyone has to follow. This means people know, it's tied in with paternalism as well, as if other people know what's best for other people. So people are dictating how to protest, how to conduct themselves in the face of oppression. There's only one right way to do it. We know better than everyone else. And the other pattern that I want to bring up is fear. And this is throughout discourse on violence and nonviolence, the pattern of fear is utilized. And this can seem quite obvious that if people are afraid of violence, then they will obviously be against violence. You know, that's the idea, that to be afraid of what's happening outside on the streets means that you want more protection brought in, more police, etc. So it's a pattern that keeps us in a kind of trauma response. If we're feeling afraid, we're not going to think very clearly, and we're going to be much more vulnerable to solutions that aren't actually healthy and non-oppressive. Okay, so you can just pause and notice how those patterns might make you feel for a second. And you can be aware that we're not feeling in danger of violence at the moment. So just look around and try to regulate your nervous system a bit more than maybe it was a minute ago. Okay, so this information is based on Peter Gelderloos's book, How Nonviolence Protects the State. And it's a very big book. We can't do it justice, as I said. And there are particular chapters that I'm going to highlight for the purposes of us starting to question things that we didn't used to question. So here's the first chapter. It's that nonviolence is ineffective. So often movements, protests might cite Gandhi and the US civil rights movements as examples of nonviolence being effective and successful. So we're going to unpick that a little bit. And these are questions I'm going to ask, and hopefully it makes you want to go away and find the answers to them. So, was Gandhi's use of nonviolence or pacifism, was it the only tactic being used in India, or was there a diversity of tactics? Was he revered widely and throughout the struggles? Or were there times that a large number of people disagreed with the nonviolent tactic? Were there more militant actors in the struggle who garnered huge support and even won elections? And would we say that Gandhi was actually even successful? Did India gain liberation? Or might we say that colonial rule was replaced by neo-colonial rule? And if we look at the actual time period in which this was happening, were there other mitigating factors in Britain stepping back? Was its own military power being weakened due to world wars and other conflicts at the time? So asking all those questions, and you can probably guess that the answers are that things were much more complex than we thought. We can question whether nonviolence itself was effective in what happened with India. And if we look at the state of India now, would we say that it's liberated? Okay, then moving on to the US civil rights movement. There were military tactics being used. There was a diversity of tactics. We see that governmental reforms did happen after there was violence. And when it came time for the white people in power to negotiate to end the protests, they favored the nonviolent people because they'd be able to protect the status quo. And also they knew that there was growing support for the more militant parts of the movement. For example, the Black Panther Party, Blacks were nearly 50% supported their policies. And just like with Gandhi, we can ask, is this an example of a movement that was even successful? The US government met the liberal white progressive demands. Things were no longer overtly segregated. But when we look at the way the United States is now, that it's still unequal and segregated, looking at all the different indicators, looking at what's been happening with Black Lives Matter, with medical inequality, who's hurt most by COVID, by poverty, in prison, etc., we see that the civil rights movement wasn't as successful as people make out to be. And so why highlight this as a success of nonviolence? Now, both Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. supported militant struggles elsewhere. So it wasn't that they were across the board advocating for pacifism or nonviolence. They actually prioritized goals over the tactics. And nonviolence is just one kind of tactic. Okay, pause. Take that in, and I encourage you to actually pause the video if you like. And if you're in the Facebook group, you could go to the guide on nonviolence in a violent world and share your thoughts and reflections with other people who've been to the workshop or have watched the videos. Or you can go to the website and sign up for a workshop. Okay, nonviolence is racist. It tends to be middle-class white pacifists who call them, who are part of the nonviolent movement. And they tend to ignore the violence against non-privileged people. So they're not experiencing violence and they're advocating for nonviolence and telling people who are experiencing violence that they need to be nonviolent. And they tell the non-whites or the people who aren't as privileged, working class white people, etc., they tell them to be patient and they should wait until enough privileged white people are willing to do something on their behalf. They believe that If only enslaved people had used nonviolent tactics, they could have gained their freedom. They think that indigenous people could have been successful against genocide and the colonialists if only they'd used nonviolent tactics. This kind of thinking protects the status quo. This is a violence that protects the status quo because the people that are most affected by the violence of the state are the people who they have more of a stake in what's happening, and yet they're being told that they can't do what they need to do to stop suffering, to fight back. And just notice that this could be challenging a lot of beliefs that we thought, that we had about nonviolence and about violence. And it can be really challenging if we have a particular faith that says nonviolence, pacifism is the only way. If we're in a movement that's saying that, it really takes a lot of time to think about the nuances of it. And we tend not to give ourselves the space to do that. Nonviolence is statist. So the people that have the power are the state. And if you want to change something about the state, then you need to have access to the people in power in order to influence the power structure. The people with the most access to that power are privileged people, which tend to be white, wealthy people. And even middle-class people have more access than working class or poor people. And so, again, if we're saying that you need to go through a nonviolent route to make your demands to the state, then you're biasing it towards the people who don't experience the violence. And so it will be through their lens and their bias that they will be asking for change. And throughout our society, from the time we go to school, people are trained to accept being ruled by a power structure. And so Peter argues in this book that pacifism is a form of learned helplessness. So it's like we're asking the state, the government, to please do something. We believe in the goodwill of the state. And we're like a well-trained dog who, rather than biting the attacker, the state, which holds all the military and has sanctioned means of violence, rather than bite that attacker, the dog lowers his tail and hopes that they will stop attacking. So we're well trained in meeting power in that way from a state of helplessness. And pacifism and nonviolence tactics are just a way to say, yes, you've got the power, and we're just hoping that you will listen to what we say and do what we ask. There's an example in Greensboro in the United States in 1961, and there were Blacks went in to a protest, and they specifically decided not to take any weapons. They wanted to show that they were going in peacefully. Well, the police and the FBI collaborated with the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party. And those Black people had relied upon police protection, and 5 of them ended up being killed and many more beaten and arrested. And the racist thugs got away. So this isn't even something that we need to go back to the 1960s to look at. We see this happening in the United States now, where the police are looking the other way when the far right is, being violent on the streets against people. We see it in the UK with varying, police responses to different kinds of protests, anti-vaccine protests versus protests against police powers, protests against sexual violence against women, especially when a police officer committed the crime. We can see that the police aren't on the side of the public. And this is something that we can reflect on. I've got a future workshops coming up around accountability and justice. And we think about, if not the police, then how do we keep each other safe? Because there's so much evidence that the police aren't there to keep us safe. But people have a hard time imagining what would we have instead. And that's what those other workshops are about. So Peter argues that the struggle against authority will be violent because authority is violent. And authority won't change unless it feels threatened. So any kind of lobbying for system change is going to be a waste of scarce resources, because it's not in their interest to change. We cannot rely upon their goodwill. The state wants to protect itself, and so there's the self-perpetuating power of the state. And if there's any kind of like nonviolent protest and they seem to be getting away with it, it's because they don't think it's going to change very much. And if they actually do feel threatened, then they'll bring in the military. And we can see that the US military is becoming more and more militarized. I live in Colombia, and the police is already militarized here. And if you're using nonviolent tactics and they bring in the military, it's not going to work. Notice how your nervous system is doing and look around. We're pretty safe in this moment in our homes watching this right now. Nonviolence is patriarchal. The same that we were saying about it being racist, we could say, if we define patriarchy as the men dominating women, the same thing applies in terms of who has more access to power, who has more access to state power, who uses violence against whom more. And by saying that we only advocate for nonviolence, who are we protecting in that case? Okay, feel free to actually pause the video, go into the Facebook group, give your comments and thoughts, see what other people have written, or join me for a live workshop sometime. Check out the website. Okay, so I want to bring up, Peter brings up tokenism, the idea that if we want to protect our point of view, then we will look for people who support our point of view. And we'll look for people who are Black or Indigenous or women who support the point of view that says nonviolence is the only way to respond to any kind of oppression. And so that's where tokenism comes in. And that's why I have the workshop on internalized oppression, so that we can recognize when we're not feeling our complete power because we're believing messages that society sends to us, like men are told you're expendable. If there's any violence, it's you have to go out and protect women and children, or children being told you're not smart enough, you don't need to be told reasons for things, and etc. And we believe those things. And we want to get good at recognizing when tokenism is happening and not being vulnerable to it and not using it. So choosing a middle class Black, Indigenous person of color to support views isn't necessarily representative of all Black, Indigenous people of color. And so we can recognize that certain people's voices will be raised, or like with Martin Luther King Jr., certain quotations will be circulated, ignoring the more difficult things that he had to say about liberals and about more militant struggles. Okay, just a couple minutes left here. So Peter says we have a few options here. One is that we can actively support this system of violence, or we can tacitly support it by not doing anything to change it. So we're just failing to challenge it, and so we're tacitly supporting the system. Or we could support some of the existing forceful attempts to destroy the system of violence. So we could be giving money, sheltering people, offering our support to these struggles that are happening to destroy the system of violence. Or we could ourselves be pursuing new ways and original ways to fight and destroy that system. But we are all choosing one of these, whether it's implicitly or explicitly. Okay, so we are in the midst of a war, and neutrality is not possible. Just what he's saying. And that there is nothing in this world currently deserving of the name peace. Rather, it is a question of whose violence frightens us the most, and on whose side will we stand. Okay. So to counter this and to give another perspective, which some might recognize as being kind of a liberal perspective, parts of it, but let's see if we can use it as a tool. We're looking at Mickey Cashton's article that she wrote on Medium called "Is Nonviolent Use of Force an Oxymoron?" So you don't have to spend too much time on this quotation from her because we're going to unpick the whole thing. But the use of force, she says, is consistent with nonviolence to the extent that we use the least amount of force possible, with the most love possible, aiming at recreating conditions for dialogue, that we make the choice using as much non-reactive discernment as possible, with as much support for the choice as possible, and while mourning not seeing another way to respond to a situation in which vital needs are at stake except to use force. Okay, I'm gonna slow that down now. Use the least amount of force possible. So an example could be if your child is running into the street and they're about to get hit by a lorry. You might not need to, grab them and throw them, breaking their bones in order to get them to stop. It could be as simple as stop, and they stop themselves from going into the road. But we're choosing, when we have the choice, we would make the choice to use the least amount of force possible. And this is where she says possible, which I think does kind of make it more palatable so that it's not protecting status quo. With the most love possible. Well, there's a particular founder of an organization that sometimes I wish I could punch. And I'd say, well, does that make sense? Like, I'm not in immediate danger. If he suddenly was in front of my face, would it make sense to punch him? And am I doing it with love? Whereas if we're saying that there's a police officer beating someone on the street and we use force to stop that from happening, I would think that we are doing that with love, because it's the love of the people, of humans, and they shouldn't be oppressed in such a way. And we want to stop people being harmed in that way. So it's out of our love for everybody that that's happening. Aiming at recreating conditions for dialogue. So if I was to see a parent hitting a child in public, and I used force to stop the parent from doing that, I would want to then start a conversation with that person and say, what's going on? Are you having a really horrible day? Like I would want to have this conversation. This, we might say, based on what we've been talking about, this isn't possible with the state. State doesn't want to enter dialogue, or it will pretend to want to, but it's not in a position of, being open to that, because they're protecting their own interests. Using as much non-reactive discernment as possible is kind of talking about triggers. So if we are able to say, I want to punch that founder, but it's probably not a good idea. If I have that kind of presence of mind, I don't need to act on a trigger. But obviously, if we're on the street and we're angry and whatever, then as possible, no judgment on people who find themselves in situations where they are reactive. And that's just the way it has to be. As much support as possible. If we're going to be using force, we don't want to do so in an isolated way. We want to be able to think clearly. We need support. We need people around us. I was in Extinction Rebellion, and they did attempt to support people who are taking action, with arrestee support, and when people are leaving jail, support for people as they leave. This sense of not doing it alone is really important, and thinking things through with other people, like an affinity group. While mourning not seen another way would be to know that we wish that there was another way to do something. We wish that we didn't have to intervene in that way. We wish that the world was peaceful and that we didn't have to interrupt the violence of the state in this particular way. So it's being grounded and knowing how complex it is. And it's not just, well, they're wrong, they have to die kind of thing. It's noticing that this is really hard stuff, and that we need to take the time to notice that. And lastly, she states that use of force makes sense in a situation where vital needs are at stake. So once again, my wanting to punch someone when they're not really threatening me and my vital needs doesn't really make sense. But we can ask, what are vital needs? Clean water, clean air, a livable planet, people being allowed to live no matter what color of skin they have. These are vital needs. And so the question is, what are the best tactics to use to interrupt the violence that we see in that way? Okay, that was it. I hope you're not doing this work alone. I hope that you are able to talk about this with other people, either in a Facebook group, or you can do a live workshop. And there'll be links to how to find all those things. And I appreciate any support that you can give for us out here in Colombia. The cost of living is very low, which means that British pounds and US dollars go a really long way, even a little bit. So you can find me on PayPal at HeatherLuna1. And thank you, and hope to see you again soon.